Bien, bonjour à toutes et bonjour à tous.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We'll continue with our debates with our theme, Health Crises, a Disorganized Europe. Pierre Carly, Philippe Juvin, Isabelle de la Mata Barranco, all three of you, I will ask you to come up to the table, and Jean-François Lemoyne will be our moderator for this first debate. Please take a seat. In Europe, as elsewhere, health crises continue to frequently occur. Not a year goes by without a new affair making the news, be it eggs contaminated with fipronil or baby formula containing salmonella. And each time it's the same uncoordinated panic while officials try to assess the situation and to react. The problem is that the suspects are always one step ahead, since contrary to investigators, they recognize no borders. You may remember that in May 2011, an epidemic caused by the E. coli bacteria led to widespread panic, first in Germany, then all over Europe. The case was initially handled at the level of the German lender, who wrongly incriminated Spanish cucumbers. Due to a slow response and administrative barriers, the European authorities were only alerted 20 days after the start of the epidemic. As for the real culprits, sprouted seeds, it turns out that they had been hiding from the beginning on a German organic farm. Ironic. With investigators like these, no need for an accomplice. It's obvious that with at least as many healthcare authorities as member countries, Europe is clearly not equipped to deal with such a crisis. So what's the solution? The creation of an elite intervention team. Just imagine some 100 experienced European professionals, experts in epidemiology, biology, and medicine, equipped with resources comparable to those of the forensic police. Performing regular simulations of serious health crises, these super investigators would be able to inform politicians minute by minute. In a nutshell, a sort of healthcare task force, finely connected to the reality of the crisis on the ground, to support rapid decision-making. Did you say elementary, my dear Watson?
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. C'est toujours la même.
Good morning, everyone. The cucumber, it's the Spanish who benefit from them and the Germans who pay. Now, thank you for coming. When you discovered the subject this morning, I had a real shock. I don't know whether it's the use of cannabis, but Guy is acting like Tom Cruise or Bruce Willis. I think it'll be difficult to talk about setting up this healthcare SWAT team or healthcare task force. Well, first of all, in Brussels, they don't even have a SWAT team. So let's hear from each one of you so that you can give us your feeling. I don't think there's much of a consensus on this. So do you think it's a good idea, this healthcare task force? Yes or no? Madam, we will start with you because you represent Europe. Thank you very much. You laughed when you saw the film. Yes, it was funny. Well, a SWAT team, we already have this European Medical Corp, the European Medical Body, which can intervene. So we have that. We haven't seen them in France. Well, France, so within the European Union, we don't use them. You have to ask them to intervene. That's different. In health, you know that national competencies and subsidiarity take precedence. Well, Europe has the reputation to have brilliant counselors, but we also have men in the field who are just not far from Brussels. They're in Paris. Now, let's start with Pierre Carly. Everybody is familiar with him. He goes to hot spots all over the capital. What is your feeling? You think we have everything at home and there's no point in setting up a European SWAT team? Well, I know what the SWAT team is. So, yes, there's an idea. There's an interesting idea. Perhaps we're not responding to the right question. Yes, we can do better. We can do better. That's my answer. Philippe Juvin, you are a member of the European Parliament and professor of emergency medicine. Well, the European MPs are very consensual. As you know, that we don't have a majority, so we always have to find agreements with our political adversaries. First of all, I think there are many more things that exist than I actually knew about, but it's true, they don't work as well as we could hope in Europe. I think there's a real quantum leap that we could make to improve quality, but this will depend on the things we will discuss here. Legislative modifications, for one. It's very easy to say Europe, Europe, Europe. Europe isn't doing things properly, but the European Union functions on legal bases that are decided by the citizens. And the treaty is quite a straitjacket that we have to work within. So you would have to change the treaty if you want to work differently. So you said it was difficult, you said it didn't exist, and you say you need a lawyer at the head of the SWAT team. No, we simply need to be honest intellectually. This whole debate around Europe that we hear in every sector, we talk about health crises here, but there are many other subjects. First of all, what are we talking about? What is Europe? Are you talking about the European Commission? Are you referring to the 28 and very soon the 27 member states? Well, before asking ourselves what is Europe, let me understand what we mean by a health crisis, because that's not very clear for all three of you. For you, Isabelle, what is a health crisis? A health crisis is something that impacts more than one member state. So it's a transborder, and it has an impact on the health system, the healthcare system in the European Union. You said, for example, the Paris attacks are not a health crisis. No, it's a crisis that has health implications, but it's not a health crisis. You saw Pierre Carly, who doesn't agree with you. For you, is it a health crisis? Well, partially, yes. It's a crisis where health plays a very important role. So the topic, I do agree with the definition that Madame gave, but we have to find another name, maybe an exceptional health or sanitary situation. What does this mean? At a given moment, there are events that occur, or the perception that the population has of these events, which lead us to react with the overall health care system. So it's much broader, but that does determine the impact. So for you, the cucumber, the incriminated Spanish cucumber, was an exceptional health crisis or an exceptional health situation. Well, in practice, you need to be able to analyze and send the information and then react. We talked about the initiative of the European Medical Corps. I think it's an excellent idea, but using it and deploying it, it doesn't respond to all of the situations. For a terrorist attack, why is that a health crisis? Well, the day after the attack, what type of phone calls did I have? I had people here calling me saying, I'm with you, I support you, and then people who managed the emergency services in other cities said, what did you respond to? What do you need? So there was a lack of information. We need to communicate better, share information. That's just as important as intervening in the field. Philippe Juvin, for you, the crisis would be Ebola in Africa. Why is that a health crisis? Well, a health crisis is what? It's a situation that disorganizes the social core and that has a health origin. It can be Ebola, it can be the cucumber. I think the attacks were a health crisis because the entire social body was disorganized. But if we take our European glasses to analyze this problem, a European-based health crisis has transporter impacts or impacts that require, because the capacity of the state are overwhelmed, it requires the assistance of another state. That's the whole topic. The European question here is the European Union is legitimate in acting if one member state requests intervention on its territory. We can't say, oh, let's go help the Italians if the Italians haven't requested this, because only if Italy considers that they're overwhelmed can we intervene, and they request it. So Ebola is a linked to a virus, an African virus, but the problem is that this can be transformed from an exterior crisis into a European crisis. Well, the European Union cannot be indifferent to what's happening elsewhere in the world. This is why the Europeans intervened in Thailand, in Africa, everywhere in the world. For Ebola, were you organized for the return of the healthcare professionals? Yes, we were organized. There was a European organization for the returns. It took much more time than we had anticipated because we didn't have the cooperation of some member states. We knew that there were some member states that had been prepared and they didn't want to collaborate with our organization. A lot of pilots didn't even want to bring passengers back who were possibly ill. Only a few very specialized airlines who are not based in Europe were volunteers, and it was not cheap to use them. But nevertheless, they did the job. And this is something that we can understand. There's a notion that's important in Europe. What Philippe says is true. We don't all have the means to maintain all these resources that we would need for a national crisis. So we need to have this common pot where we put our resources together. So let's continue in defining a health care or a health crisis. You said a virus would, if it's a Kalashnikov, it's not a health crisis, and if it's a virus, it is a health crisis. If it's a national health crisis, it's simply for France. So then we wouldn't intervene because it has to impact at least 2 member states. There are treaties and the legislations say that the member state has a subsidiary authority over its health care. So we can't intervene. However, we can intervene in Liberia or in the Republic of Congo. But there's only one exception, which was Greece for migrants. So we are talking about Europe here. I understand that you're ready to intervene all over the world. But for example, if there was a health crisis, the current problems of the emergency services, is that a health crisis? No, that's an organizational crisis. But let me give you another example of a health crisis that responds to the definition. There was a fire here with 80 serious burns, victims with serious burns. If this happened to us, we would probably bring in help from 5 or 6 different member states. We have the Burned Victims Association that intervened, and we saw this in Romania. We saw the need, for example, for just 80 people. It's necessary to mobilize all of Europe, and Europe is ready to intervene and help. There's one European Medical Corps that just does only this. And yes, for these acute situations where lives are at danger, it's the proximity of the response that's important. We can never change that. But everything afterwards can be pooled. The evacuation resources, the treatment of the post-crisis is also very important. This is something that we often neglect. In other words, how are we going to reestablish our continuity and quality of care? This is our resilience that is at stake. There's another example in Germany of E. coli, an E. coli epidemic as well, where everyone was suffering from embolisms. So we had to find beds even outside of the European Union. So there is a European civil protection body that can be set up. And why don't we just snap our fingers and have it intervene immediately? Well, France is a very nationalist, centralized country, and we can't even snap our fingers on for a national response. And so the states have actually accepted to delegate portions of their sovereignty to do so. For example, it might be a Polish or a Finnish person who will take charge, and nobody is ready to delegate to other people from other countries. But we are currently implementing a system whereby the European Union would own a certain amount of equipment, pumps, equipment to search for people in the rubble, and fire prevention equipment, firefighting equipment. And this equipment would be based in several places in the European Union, and it would be available to this European body with human resources that would be made available by the member states. Because the European Union isn't going to just pay people to stand by and wait for a crisis to occur. If we increase taxes to do that, that wouldn't be acceptable. Well, you're reaching the end of our debate. But let me finish with the idea of a sanitary crisis. Levothyrox, this thyroid medication, is that a health crisis? Yes, there is a disorganization of the social body, in my opinion here, where there was a media campaign. There was some fake news, a lot of anxiety. What is the disorganization of the social core or the social body? Well, in the 18th century, we would have said Paris is on the barricades, but this is a disorganization, but it isn't a transporter disorganization. Now, for our European representative, for you, Levertirox, has that crossed the borders? Well, I think that was a media crisis, but not a health crisis. Okay, now let's criticize the journalists. Well, so now we've identified what we mean by a health crisis or a media crisis. Well, the Spanish cucumber, for example, was a good example of. Well, I'm a journalist, and I'm used to people criticizing journalists, so don't worry. What is the role of journalism with respect to anxiety and health? Well, often it transforms one individual case into a general, widespread case. And so the journalism has a huge anxiety-creating power. Yes. This anxiety is suggested by journalists. It's unbelievable to see that we have information tools that are extremely powerful, and they could be vectors to help us organize. They could be vectors for intervention. They could allow us to convey public health messages clearly, and most of the time, these tools are used to communicate what journalists think is the most interesting. Are there not some guilty parties? Are there not people doing their work not correctly? Well, let's speak pragmatic. There are just as many stupid people among journalists as among doctors and among mechanics, garage mechanics. So I think there's the same proportion of idiots in every profession. Why do journalists do this? Well, it's because the public likes to be afraid. They like to be anxious. You can't neglect this. There are many topics that you might find interesting that nobody will listen to. But it's true to a certain extent. But I think there's a limit. As experts, as professionals, as people involved in European organizations, we need to help the journalists dose. And anxiety is always a bad counselor, especially in these crises. Taking hasty decisions often leads to disaster. The number of times where we changed laws and regulations to respond to one-shot situations that then had impacts, negative impacts on other situations. So we need to be flexible when you're on in the front pages, in the headlines. It's too late. You're in a cycle. Have things gotten worse with the internet or better? Well, internet, social networks, it's even worse. But do you use them or not? Yes, we try to use them increasingly, but it's an excellent thermometer. You know that doctors like to take the temperature. The social network is excellent in terms of crises. We can see what's happening. We've learned to adapt and use these tools, but the real topic would be to try, during a crisis, to transform the message, the negative message of fear and anxiety and the lack of resources. There will always be a lack of resources. Transform this into a positive message where we react, we build, and we fight against something.
Do you feel as aggressive towards journalists also? Yes. Yes. We only talk about bad things in the news. The good news never makes the headlines. They are constantly stoking the fire and playing with people's fear. And good news is never selling for newspapers, and they prefer bad news, and it's even worse on the internet. Do you have a communications department? Well, we do, but we don't do it very well. But you've never called me. The scientists, health specialists generally communicate very badly, and we always lose in this battle. I don't agree. People in health communicate very well. No, you have to just pick the right people, and that's your role as a journalist. Do you think the media are bad particle accelerators? Yes. But we realize that they're not the only ones to accelerate the particles. The public is waiting for this acceleration. Some professionals also find advantage in increasing the crisis. It allows them to demand resources. So everyone finds an interest in making situations more dramatic. You're a politician, so it's good to reassure your voting public, all these crises. No, you don't use them? No, I don't believe so. I think politicians have understood that it's a lose-lose situation. You talked about social networks. The beginning of a crisis in trust, was the contaminated blood and mad cow disease. Even at that time, the authorities had not identified that there was possible transmission to human beings. They didn't hide it. They just didn't know it. So the time that it took to do research, the cucumber, the time to actually discover the exact nature of the initial pathogen is not compatible with the tweet or the news cycle where people want to know immediately what's happening. Yeah, but if the cucumber is responsible, you have to warn people who are eating them. And the easiest way of warning people is to say, is at the news at 8 o'clock in France. But the consequence of that is that we incriminated this Spanish cucumber. People stopped eating Spanish cucumbers, and Russia closed off its imports of European fruit and vegetable. That's 300 million euros of loss per week for Europe. So if we don't tell the truth, it's disastrous. But if we make a mistake because we want to say too much based on the principle of precaution, we can have just effects that are just as bad. So do we need a head of communication at the head of the medical task force? Well, we do have someone in charge of communication. Well, if we create the task force, we need a head of communication. Well, we don't need a head of communication. We agree and we all communicate. So Mr. Carly agrees we have to get around the table and talk about that. Who has the right to deliver a message that can go on social media? It's a question of expertise and the definition of the problem. Do we focus on emotion, or do we try to give a rational argument concerning topics where we're uncertain and we have to make progress? So communication is important. Communication is a tool and not an end in and of itself. So you're saying doctors don't know how to communicate. Maybe you need to train them. And before you create your task force, you need to have a media task force with a European label. Well, we're trying to work on communication. For rubella, we've had new cases. It's a real health crisis. But we're not being able to convince populations that we have to convince people. France is one of the 40% of the French population doesn't believe in vaccination. So we can convince the media. One media is very strong, 2 million people today, that's consultation. And don't forget that informing patients is important by doctors. And a lot of doctors don't believe in vaccination. That's a real problem, especially against measles, not rubella. So let's continue. So we felt that we were unjust with Europe when we prepared the debate, because Europe does a lot more than what we thought. You're a European MP, Philippe Jouvin. How are decisions made in Europe? I know that there are different levels of decision-making. Well, generally, when we say we don't understand anything about Europe, it's because you haven't looked. It's not very complicated. How does it work? Quite simple. You have the European Commission, and the role is to draft laws. We call them regulations or directives, and the European Commission presents them to two chambers. In France, we have the Assembly and the Senate, and in Europe, we have the Parliament and the Council. Council, 28 members, and they amend the text, and in the end, the Parliament and the Council meets, and we vote on a text that becomes a law. That's how it works. It's simple. So my first comment, when in a member country you're saying Europe took an impossible decision, sometimes it's true, but it's not true for big countries like France. Since the Treaty of Rome in 1958, there isn't a single text, a single law that was decided against France. France has always said yes in the end to the laws that were adopted. And when you have a French minister who says Brussels made a decision that we don't agree with, they're lying, because they've accepted the decision in Brussels. That's my first point. And secondly, the European system does have impacts on health. We're giving powers to Europe in the functioning treaty. And in the health powers, what do we say? Health is a national competency, and the European Union in Article 4 and Article 6 the European Union supports the states at their request to coordinate actions. So health crises belong to the competencies that are shared between the member states and the Union, but can only be this way if the states ask for a European intervention. And then I'd like to address the financial question now. The European Union budget, 165 billion euros per year. And we say, yes, but look at the Americans, what they do with that. 165 billion euros for the EU, the US, over 3,000 billion euros per year. When the EU gets a federal-type budget like the US has, 160 against 3,300, we can start making comparisons. The EU right now is a conjunction of states that agree to work together, and it doesn't work well in health, and I have lots of examples to give you. It's because the states did not do their job. So we get the feeling that it could work, it doesn't work, it's a problem that comes back to the states. So we're off to a bad start for our European task force. It's a bit of a hypocrisy, but it's voluntary. We have different questions with human health and animal health. I know some examples. I work in general medicine. We have all of the powers. Even if other countries, France and Germany, are against it, we have the competencies in the treaty, but we also have the financial means. When there's a crisis with animals, we can vaccinate animals, but we can't vaccinate children. We had the African swine flu, but it was impossible. We could act, but it was impossible. It's impossible to act with these measles outbreaks now. We're reaching the end of the debate. I'd like to do some self-criticism. We criticize Europe. That was my role today. But I think we can criticize ourselves for simple reasons. It's our involvement. In the European Medical Corps that's being created, there are very few French people involved. The professionals did not rush to join in. We created a Europe of civil security means of intervening in a military level, but we could get more doctors, more field elements involved. But why? We're on a national base, and we're often very active and busy on the national base, and we're not necessarily open to bigger opportunities when we open the window. Professionals can't rush in. It's not the professionals that sign up to the database. It's the member states that have to propose teams. So it's the member states that have not gotten sufficiently involved. And national teams don't only work on European crises, they also work on national crises. And when there's a question, we can call them. There is a certain type of schizophrenia in France and in other European countries where we say Europe doesn't do enough. But when we say in that case for them to do more, we have to give them more powers, the delegation of sovereignty, and people say, no, no, absolutely not. So we have to know what we want, and what does the future hold? Either we consider with structures that can be implemented little by little with powers that are transferred, but the European Civil Protection Body was created in 2001, and it took many years to roll it out. I'm favorable to the massive transfer to the EU of some of our prerogatives. In the fight against crime, I think that we should create a European-style FBI that must be given a means of coercion, a means of investigation, and these are all national competencies. If we don't do that, we will end up with a point that the Commission itself raised. Given all of the competencies that we want to give to deal with migration, et cetera, we're working with a constant budget, and we can't exclude, and it's written in an official text of the Commission, that a certain number of shared competencies, including health crises, must be given back to the states because we don't have a budget in Europe to deal with it. So the train of the European debate has started. We could last all day, but we have to conclude, unfortunately. We see that it's not simple, and I want to make Guy Valencien happy. He launched this debate. If we dreamt a little bit, who could define a task force this way? Europe? We could meet together with Commission. We get an answer in 10 years. He already gave the example of the civil service task force that took more than 15 years to set up. Is this something that you could hear? Would you want to set this up? Does it seem like a good idea? For me, it seems like a good idea, but I repeat that there's already the European Medical Corps. Who makes it up? People in the field, epidemiologists, biologists. What would the task force represent? We would need people from the field. You can't solve everything in the commission or in an office. What we could do is learn from our mistakes, and we make a lot of mistakes. On these topics, these are not simple. The debate is not simple. We characterize it a little bit, but we have to learn from what we've done. The controlling information, sharing information is not something that costs a lot, and we can create a community of spirit that turns into a community of action. We need to share information, bring down the intellectual barriers, and let's work together. Who would manage it? This task force. It would be the Commission, I think, with European agencies. Can we imagine permanent members like on alert, like our firemen who would train? Since I'm in favor of creating this type of task force that wouldn't only exist to deal with crises, but would exist constantly, we would have to set up a supranational organization. So we have to accept one day that a Finnish person, how we deal with the problem in Corsica. It's going to take a little bit of time to get people to accept that type of thing. Do we have the financial resources to set up a permanent body? For operational reasons and political reasons, we have to give reasons to the Europeans to live together. And the European body, this European task force, has a political side. Europeans should say, yes, we're doing great things together. Renan said, a nation is when the men and women that make up the nation want to do great things together. We've been working on that for many years now. Not enough. I propose that we set up bodies of this type that allow the Europeans to work together. You talked about a Finnish person deciding in Corsica. I talk about an English person in Necker. Well, let's not talk about England anymore. That's not, we don't have that problem anymore. We worked a lot with the English, and we have a lot of good work that we've done in terms of health, but that's over now. But operational results are important. We need saying you can maintain people in hospitals and leave them in a cocoon and just call on them when you need them. It won't work on any topic. It never has. So operational people, yes. But just one word. Allow me to finish. One word, we can share the task, like Canadairs that are used everywhere. You don't need many, you need to share them. Sharing the task between the different countries and learning to work together, that's going to be important by sampling, by using a type of on-call duty. This month, one country's on charge of emergency response, and this is something that we could do at a less of a cost. Well, we need experts without conflicts of interest? Yes, we need experts, but we already have them in the member countries. I don't think we should create something specific with people waiting, twiddling their thumbs while waiting to be called on. We have experts in the member states. Let's use them. You want pre-established scenarios? Well, that's part of the job. There are exercises that are run regularly, and what's important is that these exercises be multinational from the outset. Pierre talked about exchanging information, and that's clearly the first stage, and this is theoretically planned, and it should take place. The European Court of Accounts talked about chemical risk. Only 14 of the 27 member states sent their pre-established emergency plan. Everyone has to do it, but 14 of 27 have done it. So there's already work to be done. When he was explaining how things work with the legislation, once the legislation has been established, it's up to the Commission to monitor that things are working well. Are there means of coercion? There's a procedure of infraction. It ends up in front of the courts. It can take years and years. So back to earth with Pierre Carly. Research projects were financed by Europe, and perhaps in European research projects we're ahead in terms of European operations. We've working on communicable diseases. So we only have 4 minutes left. Let's talk about your experience in China, where they're able to rebuild a hospital very quickly. The Chinese were afraid of the earthquakes and emergencies. If they have hospitals ready to be built. They have, for the big regions of China, they're well designed because they have a twofold role. Emergency intervention that we've talked about, they can arrive and save people. When you arrive 24 hours later, it's almost already too late. But they need to take the relay of the health infrastructure. What we don't see in most disasters is that the most difficult phase is after. The return, the resiliency is complicated to manage, and there are a lot of people that will suffer from the fact that their treatment, their health care, their daily health care has been brutally interrupted, and that counts as much as the natural disaster itself. And this is a topic that we have to learn how to deal with, where we have to set up a health fabric, avoid evacuating them, and where they lose all of their social contact. In the islands, in the French islands, that happened. Yes, but they did try to deal with it. So let's conclude now. Do you think that this task force is desirable? Could it be of electoral value? Electoral, I don't think so. Desirable, yes. In the commission, we've already talked about it. We need to establish it. Philippe, do the states have to clean up their own situations before? There are lots of things that already exist as opposed to what you can believe. We have to get them to work properly. Even just the mandatory sharing of information. Lots of member states are not complying. Pierre talked about research. 85% of research financed by public funding in Europe is carried out in one single state. So there's a lot of community margin to develop. And once we've got this thing working, the pile of dung, as the Prime Minister said yesterday, and I'm in favor of a federal step forward with coercive measures that can be applied. We need to modify treaties. The unanimity of the states is something we need to challenge. We need to have a common European conscience. Guy Valencien said that, and the Prime Minister repeated it. We didn't talk about money, but we understand that the Germans didn't want to pay for the fires in Greece. Did they pay for the Spanish cucumbers? We don't look at it in that way. Financing is a complicated topic. I don't mind talking about money. There's very little money for health. That's a problem. There's a lot for research, but not for health action. You have 30 seconds for a conclusion. I said we can improve, and I see that we're getting more interested and more mobilized. That's interesting, and it's exciting. Even if it's slow, we're seeing a common thought developing, and the fact that we're speaking honestly to each other is already one of the keys to success. So it's not necessarily something that we can achieve. The financing is not there. It won't happen overnight. I hope that Guy invites us back next year so that we can talk about it again to see if we've made any progress, not necessarily on a task force, but on the organization of healthcare in Europe. So thank you for everyone, Aurore and Guy, for the organization and for the great idea that they're developing over the last 2 years with the enthusiasm. We're at 0 minutes. The debate's over. Thank you.